Thank you, Stephanie, and a warm welcome to all of you from the Institute of Coaching on this lovely summer day, wherever you are. We're greatly privileged to have with us and back Alvaro Pascual-Leone, who was a presenter on brain health last September at our last conference, and actually will be back with us again this September to present on brain performance. And Alvaro is both an MD and PhD, which is a pretty formidable combination in the neuroscience space. He's a full professor in neurology at Harvard Medical School, and he was just saying that a new position has been created. He's now chief of the Division of Cognitive Neurology at Beth Israel, which is one of the Harvard hospitals. What's special about Alvaro is that having, over the last few years, the Institute has really endeavored to reach out to people who can translate the latest in neuroscience discoveries into language and constructs that coaches can use. And there are few and far between neuroscientists, neurologists, and neuropsychologists even who are familiar with the coaching world, familiar with sort of the layman's, the fact that our mandate is to really help our clients who are largely laymen change their brains. And Alvaro in particular has a knack, a special quality in being able to translate the science of neuroplasticity into concepts that coaches can use. So we're really fortunate to have Alvaro with us today. And for those of you who saw him speak last September, he is in fact doing some his presentation will be different today, and it will be different than probably what he does in September. So this is a real treat for all of us, a nice summer treat. And with that, Alvaro, warm welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation. And maybe we'll jump right in. Before I get started, though, maybe I should take a second to share some disclosures. I'm going to tell you about some very cutting-edge discoveries that have come up of research work done by people that work in the center that I direct, but also elsewhere. The work we've done is supported by a number of grants from the NIH, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the Sidney Bear Foundation, Neuronics, and other companies. I'll tell you for each specific piece of research results that I share, who has done it and who has funded it. I'm a listed inventor in some patents that may be relevant for some aspects of the work I tell you about, and serve on the scientific advisory board of a number of companies. And we'll talk about some of label applications in as much as they are relevant to try to understand how the brain changes, what the mechanisms of plasticity are, and how this all may be relevant for coaching. Okay, so with that disclaimer in mind, I think most of you know that 1 in every 5 people or so worldwide ends up suffering and afflicted by a neuropsychiatric disorder, by a disorder of the brain and the nervous system. Some of them are what we traditionally call developmental disorders, like autism spectrum disorders or learning disabilities. Other are acquired brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, and then a whole cadre of other diseases leading up to what we now have come to call age-related neurodegenerative processes, the most well-known of which is dementias, and Alzheimer's disease being the most common dementia. But the bottom line of all this is that disorders of the nervous system afflict all of us, almost, and across all the age span, and they pose truly an unsustainable situation. The healthcare costs are already and are projected to be so high that society won't be able to cope with them, particularly in light of success of medicine that keeps, fortunately for most of us, expanding life expectancy. And unless we do something about it, with longer lives also come more number of neuropsychiatric problems. But it's not just the loss of healthcare costs, it's also the loss of productivity of people afflicted by these disorders, and ultimately the loss, not the plus, of the social and cultural benefits that are offered by the elders and that frankly are critical for our society to benefit from by elders and from elders. So we have a real problem at our hands, and it's not just understanding the cause of the problem and addressing it, it's also, once strategies are identified, helping people stick with those strategies. And that's why I welcome the opportunity to talking with all of you, because obviously coaching is particularly critical in addressing in a sustainable way the type of opportunities, new developments, new therapies, and frankly lifestyle changes that are critical for all of us to do to address this problem successfully. The reason why coaching is so important is because what, as neurologists, we are able to do is wait in time until the symptoms, until the severity of a disease is so high that symptoms manifest. So today, we wait until patients are symptomatic. That's when they come to our attention and we try to address it. Of course, we've come to realize that the symptoms come at the tail end of a long process, some of which, part of which is in a pre-symptomatic state. And so we've been moving backwards, as it were, from the point of symptoms, trying to identify earlier and earlier time points to try to intervene. And we are progressively detecting signs of a disease earlier, before it becomes symptomatic, and developing ways to intervene at that point. So that's sort of the goal of tomorrow. What I'm going to try to argue is that this is still the wrong way to think about it. That rather than going backwards from the point of symptoms progressively earlier, what we should do is start at the other end, start at the time point when the subject, when the individual is healthy, and actually frame the challenge from the point of view, what do we need to do to sustain that health, to keep the brain healthy? In other words, to keep the brain not even starting pre-symptomatic processes, but also able to resist the risk of genes, the risk of acquired illnesses, and to sustain a healthy brain across the individual lifespan. So that I think has to be the goal, and that frankly is coaching. That is not even medicine. Once you get there, what is critical is to engage individuals in the appropriate lifestyle modifications, coaching, guidance, and advice that will sustain health and minimize the risk of disease. So put differently, the focus so far has been identify illness, identify injury, identify disease, and going forward from that point, aim to try to restore brain health and to minimize the functional disability. My argument is this is the wrong end of the stick. This is unfortunately what we're faced to do as physicians oftentimes, but the real opportunity is ahead of the game. It's actually not allowing this to happen, but before it does, preserving brain health, maximizing functional reserve, minimizing therefore the risk of symptoms even in the event of an injury. And that, I hope to show you, we start to see and understand enough of the underlying neurobiology to make it possible, and we can actually translate that neuroscience into practical, quote, therapies, interventions, and that is the goal of the Brain Fit Club that we've launched as part of the division of cognitive neurology that I direct, and that I'll want to get to a point that I tell you a little bit more about. So that's the goal of my talk, to tell you that there is an opportunity to intervene here and minimize the risk from illness to develop. what do we know about the brain? Why do we have a brain? Well, we have this very sophisticated organ, and most of us have come to learn that we have this sophisticated organ to be able to interact with the world that is out there. And we talk about perception through a number of different senses, the eyes, the ears, touch, and so forth. We capture impressions from the world. In fact, that's not completely true. In fact, our brain is not a camera waiting to be exposed to what is out there. In fact, our brain is an active shaper of what we experience of the world. And most of us have heard of things like you will only see what you know to look for, kind of thing. And in turn, it is the case that our brain's primary action is indeed action, is projecting onto the world hypotheses, expectations of what the world should be. Those have been generated over evolutionary timelines and to a large degree are ingrained in our brain circuitry. And so the eyes don't simply receive information, but in fact are essentially contrasting what hypothesis of expectation the brain generates and what is then experienced, what is then encountered in the outside world. Be it the direction primarily how it might be, whether really action comes first and perception second, which we now believe or not, what is clear is that there is a two-way interaction between the brain and the world outside. However, that's not the only thing that our brain does. Our brain is not only integrating us with the outside world, it is also integrating us with the inside world. And so we have a way to get information from our organs, from our joints, from our gut, from our heart, from our muscles, to the brain. We call that interoception. And remarkably enough, it is also a two-way street. There is a way from the brain onto our organs, and that has the possibility of promoting health. That's what salutogenesis means. It also has the possibility of creating illness, and that's what the traditional notion of psychosomatic disorders is all about. It's stress and breakdown of the brain, ultimately disrupting this internal milieu monitoring machinery that the brain is as occupied with as it is with the external world. If you think about it that way, then disorders such as heart disease, diabetes, GI problems, hypertension, cancer, infectious diseases, and so on, are as much modulated by our brain as they are a problem of the organ that they afflict primarily, the heart, the lung, or the pancreas. So in other words, one take-home message I want to leave you with is that a healthy brain is essential for overall health, not just for brain health. So it's important to focus on this state of brain wellness and promote that brain health, not just because of the brain health itself and the cognitive function across the age span, but also because thanks to a healthy brain, one will overall be in better health. Now, if we dwell a little bit into what a healthy brain actually is, well, we know that the brain, the human brain, is made up of exquisitely sophisticated and differentiated brain cells. This is a drawing of one such brain cell, a neuron, by Ramon y Cajal, for which discovery he got the Nobel Prize. And some of you may know that he got the Nobel Prize alongside Golgi. Golgi had developed a methodology, this methodology of a tincture, of staining of neurons to be able to see them. So using Golgi's method, Cajal discovered the neurons, while Golgi, with his own method, remained convinced that the brain was nothing but a single, incredibly long, incredibly complex network of wiring. He did not think that there were individual brain cells in that mesh, and in fact they had a whole discussion at the Nobel ceremony when they received the prize, which Cajal concluded by arguing that it is remarkable how, even for a wise man like Golgi, it is impossible to see what is in front of his eyes because his knowledge doesn't allow him to do so, which may make you recall the point I was trying to make. The brain doesn't just simply see, the brain brings expectations, and by the way, it is a critical role of coaches to set appropriate expectations from individuals so that they are actually able to see and hear and ultimately do the things that will be best for them. So Cajal did see, because he had the appropriate mindset, that there are individual cells, and those cells we now can stain in even better ways and see how they interact with each other, and we get this type of exquisitely beautiful pictures of how different brain cells not only interact with each other, but are in turn supported by additional cells that we call glia. So at the end of the day, we have this extremely complex organ made up of highly differentiated cells, neurons, and those in turn are connected with each other, engaged in neural networks, and it is those neural networks that end up defining behavior and cognition. But to give you some numbers, we have 100 billion neurons in our brain. That's as many neurons as there are stars in the Milky Way. And that is only about a tenth of how many glia cells there are. So imagine a Milky Way that would have as many stars as we have, and then tenfold additional stars mixed into them. Each one of these neurons has about 10,000 connections, and those 10,000 connections make 1 quintillion of connection points that we call synapses. And you would think that given such amazingly staggering, almost unimaginable complexity of wiring, that once established, it'd be rock and solid stable. And yet it is not. Those connection points, we now have the way of visualizing. That's what this little picture is. And when you look at every 5 seconds, the connections, the little buttons there, the different dendrites, terminals of a brain cell make, and how stable they are in time, we now have come to realize that this staggering number of connections actually changes on average every 5 seconds, despite the fact that they are unbelievably active every second. Each one of these connections is making 1 quintillion transactions. So these are incredibly complex, incredibly dynamic, continuously changing networks. In the time it's taken me to say just that, more connections have changed than we can even imagine in their number. And that is both an amazing fact and a great opportunity. A great opportunity because the challenge, and again it's mostly a coaching challenge, is to guide those changes so that the outcome of them be the most advantageous for a given individual. Now you need to realize that our brain does this with incredible efficiency. This amazing number of transactions and these many changes of connections consume 20 watts of energy, or put differently, a 9-volt battery could drive the brain with all its changing complexity for about 5 minutes. Doesn't sound like a lot, 5 minutes, but a 9-volt battery is trivial. Most of our house flashlights use many-fold that amount of energy. So it's extremely efficient. And yet, if you consider the relative demand of the brain compared to other organs, the brain makes up 2% of the body mass, and yet it is consuming 20% of the overall body consumption. So, put differently, our body dedicates to the brain tenfold what it ought to be dedicating given how much of the body it makes up. Of course, as a neurologist, that only emphasizes the fact that the brain is the organ of importance in the body. But there is a more interesting fact linked to that, which is that this staggering consumption, relative consumption, is mostly devoted to this very rapidly changing signaling. It's mostly devoted to this plasticity, to this reshaping of connections that takes place so rapidly in time, the changes of connections in synapses. But in addition to that, it is constant in time, which is to say, when your brain is quote-unquote engaged in something, like mine is now because I'm talking, or yours is now because you're listening, the brain consumes 20% of the body energy. When your brain is quote-unquote resting because you are daydreaming or mind-wandering, your brain still consumes 20% of the energy. And that raises the question of why that might be, and the hypothesis that appears to be more and more solidified is that that is because the brain is active, what we call active, when it's figuring out to the outside world and interaction, but it's equally active when it is quote-unquote at rest for the outside world, but in fact engaged in the internal milieu. And so you can think of the brain as either enabling you to relate to the world outside or monitoring the brain, the body inside. So it never rests. It is always active. It is either devoting resources to your inside world or to your outside world. And it will be particularly critical from a coaching point of view to realize that the enough amount of time of the brain devoted to the inside world is going to be critical to promote health, to promote salutogenesis. And I'll get back to that in a second, but I'm going to make the explicit argument and show you some data that point out to the fact that appropriate introspection, meditation, and certainly appropriate rest, sleep, are crucial to promote not only brain health, but through brain health, overall health. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that we have neurons and they're engaged in these networks. Turns out we're born with a bunch of neurons, or this staggering number. So what happens as we develop? What happens if you think of the brain not as developing, then staying steady, and ultimately decaying, which is the traditional way to think about it, but if you think about the brain as a continuous development across our entire lifespan, starting in fetal time and ending when you're dead. You could call that brain span of sorts. So we're born with these cells. This is an actual cut through the brain, through the cortex of the brain at birth. See these Golgi-stained neurons. When we go to school, there are two things that stand out. One, it looks a lot more messy because there is a ton more connections between brain cells. But if you were to actually count the number of cells, if you were to count them, you would find out that the number of cells has dramatically decreased. And I'll show you some quantification of that in a second. But the point I'm trying to make with a couple of slides now is that there are changes over time, but this idea that we lose brain cells when we age is just simply wrong. We lose brain cells throughout our brain development, throughout our life, and the vast number of cells we lose in childhood, in the first few years of life. And over the rest of the lifespan, in addition to still losing some cells, it's the reshaping of connections that stands out. So that when you leave school, you have not only continued to lose brain cells, you have also lost some connections. So a mature brain has been largely pruned, and I'll get back to that in a second, but losing the appropriate number of cells and shaping the appropriate connections is critical. And with that message in mind, we need to ask ourselves what determines appropriate pruning and appropriate loss of cells so that you don't lose the ones you don't want to lose. If you quantify this loss of neurons, it looks like this. So by the time we are 18, by the time we are sort of mature, we've lost half of the cells and they have half of the connections. So the slope afterwards becomes much, much flatter. What we've come to realize is that it's not different than when you're trying to grow an apple tree. If you want to think of birth as empowering you through the establishment of as many connections as your brain through genes could potentially master, I think of it as the Wonkabator from the chocolate factory from Willy Wonka. You have this potentiality of going from one room to any other room that the body could imagine in development. But that also means that you have a very drafty house, lots of potential connections, a very noisy real estate. And so if you want ultimately to have a really rich apple or orange tree, you need to prune the appropriate branches, and that's what development is really all about. That way you get to a point where you can deliver appropriate fruit, and pruning is essential. Pruning is what educators do. Pruning is what coaches do, at least good coaches. Turns out pruning is what happens. And so it's not something that educators do. It's only good educators will do. All educators do it. All coaches do it. The challenge is to do it in the way that maximizes the benefit for the individual, because whether you want it or not, pruning will happen, and the outcome may not be beneficial for the individual. So what do we have, what have we come to realize determines successful pruning? Well, the first thing is the brain has to be challenged with new knowledge, with new skills. It's about learning to learn. It's not about doing many times over and over and over again the same single thing. There is a real advantage to this traditional education of being exposed to multiple things. Because if you do, then different connections remain stable. The second thing, it takes effort. You need to try to do what you're doing as well as possible. It's not sufficient to just sort of go for it. You really need to try hard. We know that it's easier for the brain to function and activate the appropriate connections if instructions are given by example rather than by verbal instruction. So the brain literally embodies what others do in front of us, and so therefore following proper example is a better way to shape the connections of an individual. Finally, we've come to realize that it's not just doing that changes the brain, also thinking about what you're going to do is not only capable of changing the brain, but in fact important to get the maximal impact of when you actually act. So thinking before you act is important. Rehearsing mentally the things that we're going to do is important. I'll show you some examples of that. And of course, all this takes effort, and all this takes away from the brain dedication to the internal milieu, and so therefore rest at the right time is critical. So let me give you the same story a little bit deeper into biology to give you some examples. So I've made the point already. We have genes, we have environmental factors, and those define what, how many, and what types of neurons we end up being born with. They're highly differentiated, different types of them. They lay specific layers of the cortex, and they make up our initial wiring diagram. We also get endowed initially with way more cells than we're going to have by the time we leave school, and a big challenge early on is to quote-unquote pick, to define which ones are the cells our brain can get rid of, and ultimately that leads to a better outcome than if it keeps them all. Those cells define a local cortical circuit, but those cortical circuits in turn are connected across the brain in wide-reaching networks that are extremely dynamic, continuously changing. Now, what drives that change? It turns out what drives that change are the use of the functions that they are ascribed to do. So in blue, imagine one such network with a bunch of connections to other neurons. And that connection, that set of connections, will define a given function, say function A, moving your little fingers in flexion. Whereas in red is a second network, partly overlapping in terms of the neurons that it uses, that does a certain other function. For example, opposing the little finger to the thumb. Very similar, but slightly different behaviors. If we do a lot of function A, a lot of extending the little finger, then we reinforce connections, ultimately make additional connections, and it turns out that because our brain already uses a lot of relative energy from the overall body, it ends up applying those changes at the cost of others. And so we become better at function A and worse at function B. It's not that we are unable to relearn function B, but it's going to be harder. Imagine going down the slope of a mountain that is covered with snow. The more times you go down that slope with the same skis over the same rails and tracks, it's going to get easier and easier and easier to go down that particular path. You can still redefine your path, but it's going to be harder and harder the more you've done it. That's exactly how our brain functions. It's, in a sense, a very adapted, rapidly changing market economy in a well-oiled capitalistic land.
Alvaro, may I interrupt?
Please.
We have a question from Dr. D. Gray. Is this the double and triple loop learning experiences to change routinized thinking? So this is not so much behavior, but thinking processes.
Yeah, so I think thinking processes would indeed map onto brain networks, just like behavior maps onto brain networks. And so if you think a certain way over and over again, it is indeed hard to change the way you think because of the same facilitation of structures that you use a lot at the cost of others. And by the way, that is part of the reason why thinking, we'll see in a second in more detail, becomes an important way to prime networks before you actually act. Because of course acting has not just the activation of the brain circuit, but has also the activation of the muscles or of the eyes or whatever way one actually defines the action on. But in any case, there is a re-entry, a feedback to the brain. And if you do what you're going to do wrong, you may have thought it right, but if you do it wrong, that will promote habits that may be negative ones. So yes, I think this maps onto thinking processes just as it maps onto behavior, and it maps onto the arguments of repeatedly thinking through things in a progressively sophisticated ways.
Mm-hmm. Let me also ask, because coaches are very interested in how to help people learn new things, and you mentioned the term proper examples. So let's say you're working with someone who wants to listen better or develop more rapport. Would you then recommend that they watch a video of that example as opposed to just using words so that they actually see and absorb, as you say, embody the experience? Is that what you mean?
That's exactly what I mean. So it turns out that when we say jump, or when we say, kick, a very clear action verb, but also with more complex things like love or less precise, that in terms of their semantic meaning, that those words activate not just a parts of the brain that semantically decode the information, but also the action parts of the brain, the same parts of the brain that you would use for actually jumping or kicking. So it's true that we can get there with the verbal instruction, but the degree of activation of those areas is much, much, much less than if you actually see somebody jumping or see somebody kicking in front of you, or if you mentally imagine doing it. And so, just like you're describing, if you want to convey to somebody how to properly relate, how to properly empathize, and how to properly guide somebody, to describe it may serve a purpose. To display it and have that somebody experience it by having it play out in front of him or her, it would be much more powerful a way to modulate, to prime the networks, and ultimately to make the learning stronger. Okay, so let me give you some examples of this to get you a sense of the range of it. So we know, for example, that there is a part of the brain in the back of the brain, the occipital cortex, we call it, that receives information from the eyes, and this is the part of the brain that we see with. It's not the eyes we see with, it's that part of the brain that we see with. There is a part of the brain that receives information from tactile stimulation and exploration of the fingers, and so this is the part of the brain that we detect things with the pads of the fingers. And we have now ways with brain imaging to see that activation in the back of the brain when we're seeing, or in the parietal areas, in the posterior central sulcus, on both sides when we're feeling things with the right finger in this case, because it goes to the contralateral cortex, or with the left finger in this case. And so we call this the visual cortex, and we call this the somatosensory cortex, but remember, functions like this are really networks of the brain. It's not one spot in the brain that does it. So if we see brain imaging now, like this in 3 different examples, all of them showing activation of the occipital part of the brain, one would be tempted to believe that these are 3 different examples of people seeing things. And yet that's not the case. In this particular example, this person is reading Braille. It's a congenitally blind subject that is reading Braille, has never seen, and is using the occipital part, the visual cortex, to read Braille better. This person is also a congenitally blind subject who is better than normal at locating sounds in space, the sources of sounds in space, and again is using the occipital cortex, the visual cortex, in quotes, to locate better than normal the sounds in space. And this one is a congenitally blind subject remembering a list of words and recruiting the visual cortex in order to remember more words than a sighted person would normally do. And if you think about all these examples, they evolutionarily make a lot of sense. If the brain has this phenomenal real estate and it's not, quote, needed for vision, then why not devote it to something else that is advantageous for the individual, like Braille reading, like locating sounds in space, and so forth. But one key thing that it requires is not to engage in a lot of mental imagery of seeing, because we know that blind subjects who try to remember what things look like will actually become worse Braille readers, worse verbal memory performers, and worse at sound localization, because more of the visual cortex will remain engaged in this visual imagery in that case, which doesn't help them very much in terms of localized things in the world. Now, how quickly do these changes happen, or more to the point, is this a particularity of congenitally blind subjects, or could this happen in all of us? And so a number of years ago, with the support of NIH and led by Lotfi Merabet, we did an experiment where we blindfolded subjects for sighted normal subjects for a number of days, make them absolutely blind from one day to the next, and challenge them to read Braille by touch. We spent a lot of hours teaching them Braille, At the end of 3 days, you don't see much activation anywhere in the brain when they're trying to read Braille, because it's not different than what they were like at baseline. What they were like at baseline is that they activated the somatosensory cortex right there I showed you earlier. But there is nothing in the occipital lobe now. But at day 5, now the occipital area lights up, and this is only 5 days after losing sight that they start using the quote visual cortex to process touch. 1 day after the mask is removed, that activation is gone. So what does this tell us? What this tells us is that among this enormous mess of connections, richness of connections that our brain has, it maintains, albeit latent, ways to pass information from one part of the brain to another through connections that must exist, because it takes about 1 millimeter per day to grow connections in the brain, and so therefore to bridge this long track of distance for the brain would take many weeks and months, and yet it's just a question of 48 to 72 hours that connections are unmasked, are open up. Normally, we have the visual information going to one spot, the tactile information going to the other. Not much effect of these connections. There is some, but not much. But when the vision goes away, then these connections become suddenly opened up. It's as if traffic gets rerouted, and the process, remember, the synapses change lots of times every 5 seconds, and so therefore it's not just that you reroute the traffic, it's that you right away start making the roads larger to accommodate more traffic through them. And so in a matter of very few days, these parts of the brain that before seemed to only process vision now are also used for other purposes, for the benefit of the subject. So the idea is that our brain has brain circuits. It confronts the internal and the external world. It does so with perception, with information coming to the brain, but acting upon it. But the world and the bodies change very, very fast. We can become suddenly blind, have an accident, or we can be confronted with a new product on the market, something called a smartphone, that for my father would have been inconceivable, and that for me growing up was inconceivable. And yet this is a trivial thing for our kids these days. The genetic change that shapes our brain is too slow to cope with that speed of changes in the world. Even when the genes are modified through environmental changes, that takes, that's what we call epigenetic phenomena, and that takes a time. That takes several generations generally. It's transferred through generations, but it takes time. So you can think of plasticity as nature's invention to overcome the limitations of the genome and respond to the demands of a rapidly changing internal or external world. And plasticity is therefore an intrinsic property of the brain. It's not something we can activate or we can deactivate. It's something that simply is. You will leave this webinar with a different brain than when you connected. Hopefully not a badly changed world, but it will be changed. Hopefully not permanently, but it will change. And therein lies a risk, therein lies a responsibility. When you're a coach, what you coach people to will change their brain. That's a responsibility. But it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to help change their brain in a way that makes them better, more adapted to the challenges that they want to confront. And clearly, a healthy brain is a plastic brain. So we need to keep that plasticity at the appropriate level throughout the lifespan. It's not something that is only there in childhood. It's not something that you can activate. It's something that is an intrinsic property of the brain throughout our lifespan. What we need to do is guide it. Let me give you another example so that you see some of the factors that can allow us to guide it. Imagine you set somebody in front of a computer-controlled piano, and you ask them to do a 5-finger movement exercise. When you hear the metronome beat, I want you to push a given key with a little finger. When you hear the metronome beat again, I want you to be pushing with the thumb. In between, you figure out how. I want you to push the other fingers, the in-between keys. And I want you to keep pace with the metronome, up and down the 5 fingers. But in addition, I want you to push each key with the same strength, with the same velocity, for the same amount of time in the correct sequence. It's actually a difficult thing to do for people that have not practiced it ever, and it takes some time. But if you pay people enough, they will sit there and practice for a couple of hours per day, and after 5 days, they're very good at this indeed. What we were interested in asking is what changes in the brain when we're acquiring, when we're learning a skill such as this. And you're now familiar with this part of the brain, in the somatosensory cortex, the postcentral cortex that represents the fingers somewhere around there. We call it the little homunculus, the little man laid out over the brain. So this is the somatosensory part of the brain, the part that perceives the braille symbols. This is the motor part of the brain that controls the finger movements. So we can focus on this part of the brain and ask the question, how does it change? And what we see is that when you look at this square that is centered over that part of the brain, it's about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. From day 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, literally more and more and more of the brain is devoted to finger flexion. Just like with the braille, more and more of the brain is devoted to processing stuff that is not visual when you lose vision. Extremely fast, extremely rapid change. Now, importantly, what we were able to show with this particular experiment is that if instead of setting the person down and telling them, look, I want you to practice doing this, go do it. Instead of doing that, you played it out to them, you showed them an example, and then you told them, I want you to sit here and imagine you're doing this. What you actually get is that the mental practice changes the brain in exactly the same way that the physical practice changes the brain. Not only that, at the end of these 5 days of mental practice, it only takes 5 minutes of actual physical practice to get to the same level of performance as it took 2 hours plus 2 hours plus 2 hours plus 2 hours plus 2 hours, 10 hours to get to with physical practice. So through appropriate mental rehearsal, you can change your brain circuitry, and by changing it, you can put yourself in a dramatically advantageous place with very little physical practice to then gain substantial performance. I believe this is true of motor performance, but it's also true of any other skill. So if you, to go back to Margaret's question earlier, if you see video of people relating appropriately with individuals or guiding them to their behavior, and do that, imagine doing it over and over again. Once you're actually in the place to have to do it, that pre-activation of the brain will put you in a significant advantage to actually do it and do it properly. Now, I've shown you what happens in a week of practice, this rapid expansion of the map devoted to finger flexion. But to us, that posed a problem because, you know, pianists keep practicing after 1 week. They keep getting better and better at it. They become overlearned behaviors, habits, as it were, in the way we do the things we do. So how does it happen? Does the brain become nothing but hands? It's unlikely. So we wanted to continue to go on testing subjects, and so we told them to take Saturday and Sunday off and come back on Monday, and they did, and we mapped them, and they had apparently lost what they had gained. Now, behaviorally, they had also lost, and that's not exactly surprising. It may be something that many of you have noticed. I certainly notice it. If I go on vacation and come back after vacation, it takes me a little bit of time to have the same ease in giving a talk or in examining a patient. That's because some of the connections literally have been devoted to something else while I wasn't using them for the things I use them. But in the second week, it expands again, only to shrink again and expand and shrink and expand and shrink and expand. But if you look week by week, the expansion is much less and the shrinking is much less. In fact, the maps become much more stable overall. It turns out that plasticity works through two different steps, two different mechanisms. First, there is dynamic changes of connections that already exist, this unmasking of connections or this opening up of pathways that were addressed. There's a shift of connectivity that are dependent on the connections that already exist. So that's influenced to some degree by genetic factors and by the past history of an individual. And it's extremely rapid and very flexible. Your impact of this lecture on your brain is on the basis of changes of existing neural networks. If you stop thinking about this stuff, it won't leave you with permanent structures. But if you keep thinking about these things, if you keep giving the same talk like I do, or worrying about the same issues, then there is a second step, an establishment of new connections that become established structurally and are much more lasting, but they much more. This, by the way, is also the challenge for all of you from a coaching point of view. It is reasonably easy to get somebody to modify a little bit the behavior rapidly, but it doesn't last. It doesn't stay on. And it requires the expertise of a coach that supports ongoingly the person to establish new connections and make those behaviors become more self-sustaining. And we know a fair amount of what goes on at the structural level and the molecular level. We know that behavior is supported by a network. We know that that network can change in its connections and make that behavior stronger by things as simple as seeing people do the right thing in front of you or imagining yourself doing them. We know that based on that activation, there are then mechanisms engaged that promote plasticity, that increase plasticity, and there are other mechanisms engaged that limit it, that tend to make the brain remain stable. We know what, oops, sorry about that. I apologize. We know that there are mechanisms of remodeling of synapses, of the connections, that are kept in balance between these two pull and push kind of mechanisms. And at the end of the day, there are the possibilities of modifying networks, of establishing new connections, which in turn can then be modified in the strength of the connectivity. So that we understand. We also understand that changing the brain and plasticity is really a double-edged sword. There are changes that are adaptive, that provide the substrate to learning new skills, that allow us to cope with new injuries. But there are some changes of plasticity that turn out down the road to be maladaptive, to actually limit the recovery, promote symptoms of disease, cause bad habits that one has a hard time overcoming, or actually truly disease symptomatology. And chronic pain, spasticity, dystonia, a long list of problems in neurology we now have come to realize are actually maladaptive plasticity examples. Now, to stay with the hand and give you an example of it, this is, if the movie works, somebody playing the piano, and as he plays, you'll see the index finger becoming extended. This is somebody playing the piano and the fingers become curled. These are all musicians with dystonias, and there are many different forms of them. And what we've come to realize is that these dystonias are due to the fact that as you practice, your brain devotes more of its resources to represent the fingers, but that harbors the risk that adjacent fingers may ultimately merge together, overlap together, in such a way that they are no longer differentiated. It's as if you make the little pieces of a mosaic too large, then at the end you don't have detailed resolution anymore. And the literally activation of any one finger in dystonia activates more of the part of the brain that is devoted to the fingers than in normal subjects, but there is also more overlap between the fingers. So you can think of a wiring that starts, and when skill learning takes place, connections are modified, and that ultimately is adaptive and leads you to a little bit bigger hand, but still very differentiated and to scale, like a pianist may have. But if you keep pushing it, then particularly if you have certain genetic predispositions or certain types of behavior, the way you go about doing things, then there is a blurring of differentiation between the finger hands, and you end up developing dystonia, symptoms of disease. So plasticity is an intrinsic property of the brain. It's always there, but the results of engaging it can be beneficial for the individual or not, depending on the circumstances. It is important to personalize the intervention. That's what coaches, again, are critical at. You need to understand what the person wants to do the appropriate support for that person to achieve it. And ultimately, we all need the right amount of plasticity. To have too much plasticity is not good. To have too little plasticity is not good. If you have too much plasticity, there is too much change in the brain for any one experience. If you don't have enough plasticity, it takes too much reinforcement to get there. And the key thing is that of course, we need a way to be able to measure that plasticity, but we have such a way. We can, in fact, apply a brain stimulus, sorry for the sound effect, and measure the response of the network of cells that it activates. We can then give an intervention. The intervention could be stimulation, or could be a behavior, could be whatever. Repeat a stimulus and then measure response. And depending on the effect of the intervention, the response is larger or smaller than what it was at baseline. And the amount of change and the duration of that change gives us a quantitative measure of that individual's efficacy of the mechanisms of plasticity. How capable is that brain of adapting to changes in the surrounding? That looks something like this. After a given intervention, for minutes, an intervention that may last 4 seconds, for 30 to 40 minutes, the responses of the brain would be suppressed compared to the baseline in what we call long-term depression, like plasticity, or they will be potentiated for 30 or 40 minutes in what we call long-term potentiation plasticity. And so we can quantify for any one individual and any one brain network how much potentiation, how much depression of activation it's able to master, how effective those mechanisms are. Now, if you take individuals with autism spectrum disorder, just to give you an example, we can, Lindsay Oberman has shown, supported by the NIH, that these individuals have too much plasticity. It's too easy for the brain to be modified, and the effect lasts too long. That is true for the potentiation, and it's true for the suppression. Now, that's a paradoxical thing. It means that their brain is able to learn better than that of a non-autistic individual, a neurotypical individual, and indeed it can. So that in some circumstances, under some experiences, they become savants. They have abilities that are unimaginable for those not on the spectrum. But at the same time, that's a double-edged sword, because you learn one thing, and when you go to learn the next thing, your brain is still influenced by what it learned before. And so therefore, it's given in too easily, and it's hard to erase the trace of what has happened before. That ends up creating a brain that is too noisy, and the net result of it is that it ultimately is not able to function appropriately. So we can measure in autism spectrum disorder abnormal LTP and LTD. We know that in Alzheimer's disease, LTP is lost, but LTD is not affected. And so therefore it takes too many efforts, too many times for the brain to be modified. We know that in things like diabetes, they are at risk to developing Alzheimer's disease because the plasticity mechanisms are abnormal even when diabetes is well controlled, in a similar way than they are in Alzheimer's disease. We also know that it's not just about the pathology, it's in the normal development in life. As we age, this duration of the modulation of the responses, the efficacy of the plasticity mechanisms goes down. So we're all on this slope of condemnation of having progressively less effective plasticity mechanisms. And we know, by the way, that those mechanisms of plasticity correlate very highly with how well we cognitively perform. So think about it this way. We start off with a given level of brain plasticity that's dependent on the cells that we have and their connections and how they've been reshaped by our experiences. That's determined by genetic and environmental factors. And then as we age, we are in a downward slope. However, we have something called cognitive reserve, the capacity to compensate for the performance through reopening of connections, through reinforcement of connectivities that we were seeing that can happen very fast indeed. And thanks to that, we're able to maintain a level of function that doesn't cause problems with age in some instances. And if we don't have enough cognitive reserve, we would lose the ability to sustain cognitive function. Now, fortunately, we have a way of measuring cognitive reserve, and it's a rather simple one, and I want to illustrate it for you. It's a method that was developed by Brad Manner. You're trying to stand still and not move, and we can measure with quantification very precisely how much you sway. Now, if you're trying to stand and count, say, backwards, then it turns out you sway more, because your brain is now trying to do two things at once: keep you steady and let you count. And that takes resources. And remember, it's like a 9-volt battery that is driving all this machinery. And so therefore, something gives. The give is a cost, is the difference between the single and the dual task condition. And that amount of cost is directly correlated with your reserve. The more reserve you have, the less cost you have. So we can quantify, on the one hand, the efficacy of the plasticity mechanisms. On the other hand, we can quantify precisely how much cognitive reserve one has. And so to go back to the same schematic, now we have plasticity and reserve, a sort of index of brain function, and it's going to keep sloping down over time. It turns out the slope is variable across individuals. Some individuals, if you don't do anything on their own, have sufficient plasticity to start with, or a flat enough slope that they will never develop cognitive problems. These are the super agers of sorts. But others seem to be predisposed to having significant problems, perhaps because of genetic factors or environmental factors. In addition to that, we know that if one person has a given slope pre-programmed, as it were, over time, something can happen in life, from an insult like traumatic brain injury, to a change in diet, to the lack of exercise, to particularly strong stress, to the manifestation of diabetes, such that it will change the person's slope dramatically. And even though they were not going to develop cognitive problems, now they would. So the opportunity that we have now, thanks to the advances in neuroscience, is actually to measure individuals at different time points, to diagnose, as it were, what level of plasticity and of reserve they have, and to intervene ultimately in order to restore a healthy brain ahead of the time that problems develop. And that is the idea behind the Brain Fit Club, to measure repeatedly an individual, to prescribe and supervise interventions, and to assess the benefit and in turn modify the program. This is Bonnie Wong, who is the director of the Brain Fit Club, and that's the website if you want to learn more about it. The interventions are many that one can think of, from not taking medications you shouldn't take, to taking the right diet, exercising appropriately, relating properly to others, doing meditation, doing Tai Chi, yoga, cognitive training, physical exercise, brain stimulation, and so forth. The key thing is to measure the individual brain health index, see how it's evolving, individualize a plan of intervention, and then keep reassessing the brain health index to monitor the progress, because the goal of these interventions is to actually make the brain healthier, not to let you be more satisfied that you're doing something. That's important, but what we want is to keep your brain appropriately plastic and modifiable. Because if we do that, then it'll be able to cope with the challenges that life may bring. So very quickly, let me go over some of these interventions and give you a sense of what we've learned. So we know that in terms of balance, in terms of diet, what is critical is to have a balanced diet, to have the appropriate weight. It's not obvious from the brain perspective that one thing to take is the thing to do, ginkgo or less mercury or whatever lipid forms you want, or more vitamins. In turn, what appears to be critical is to remember that you want to eat as little as possible, not to lose weight, rather than what most of us do, as much as possible, not to gain too much and feel like you're really enjoying it. So caloric restriction refers to maintaining the weight with a balanced diet that is appropriately rich in all the nutrients that we need. The second thing that we know, and this has a lot stronger neurobiology support than diet, is that physical exercise is enormously important. I'm a neurologist, and so I want to make sure that you guys walk away from this webinar realizing that physical exercise is something we should do for our brain, even more so than for our body. It turns out that the effect of physical exercise on the brain is substantial. In fact, it activates and modifies specific parts of the brain in the prefrontal areas, making literally more connections in those parts of the brain. And in doing so, it is the mechanism by which it probably actually promotes overall health, at least in a large part. And so physical exercise is important, but what is important is to push yourself. It's not just simply to show up in the gym, it's to actually push yourself. And again, one can measure brain function before and after the exercise. The same exact thing is true of mental activity, and the key thing here is to challenge your brain to learn new things, and not simply to keep rehashing that it does, even if it does good. If you have always read a lot, if you have always enjoyed reading and crossword puzzles, well, that's a great hobby to continue to have, but what you want to do is learn something that you have not been challenging your brain with. And it's important to do those things while avoiding unnecessary medication, while sleeping enough and sleeping well, because your brain, remember, needs to consolidate, to settle the connections. And then there are two things we've come to realize that are particularly interesting. It turns out that our human brain is a machine of prospecting and believing into something that transcends us, and indeed believing into something transcendent, be it God, religion, or the importance of human connections. You have a goal that goes beyond you, that actually promotes particular parts of the brain and in turn keeps the brain more capable of maintaining plasticity, and so it's important to engage at that level. And finally, the connections with others, those that surround us, is important, be it family, friends, and so forth. In an age of technology that is breaking the direct physical connection between people, what that will do to the brain, I think, is unclear. And whether technology ultimately allows us to connect both brain to brain, and what that will do to the brain is unclear. But it will have an impact, because connection with others actually promotes connections in the brain. That, by the way, is the reason why we set up the Brain Fit as a club, as a Brain Fit club, so that people actually come together and interact while they're doing these various activities. I'm cognizant of the time. I think I've reached my end as it is. I don't know if there's a couple more questions, but if you wanted more information about this application of this concepts of neuroscience and neurobiology and plasticity that can be translated to interventions, this is my email and that of Bonnie Wong, and the Brain Fit Club website contains some additional information.
Thank you, Alvaro, for just a wonderful and brilliant tour. There is one question that comes up that it's a big one, so we'll make this the last, and it may not be answerable in a couple of minutes, but the question is about the impact of emotions on brain health and development. And it would seem as though social connections and a sense of higher purpose are certainly generative of positive emotions, so one would expect that that has an impact. But what could you say around emotions? What would be the intervention there?
It's a wonderful question, and it's extremely important, and in fact, the point taken, probably something that I should have mentioned specifically. If you look in more detail at the different parts of the brain, I've been focusing a lot on the cortex, and we can think of it in some ways at a rational sort of thinking components of the brain. There are other parts of the brain, deeper structures in the brain, the limbic system and others, that are particularly modified and generating of emotions. And there are interactions between these different components of the brain, such that indeed the brain activity in its cortex, in its thinking, is literally different depending on the emotional state one is in. And so therefore, through modulating of emotional states, one can promote or suppress or control not only cortical activity, but also through the cortical activity, plasticity itself. So it's enormously important to frame these issues in the setting of the appropriate emotional state, and indeed therein lies a big responsibility, I think, of an opportunity for coaches to intervene.
So would you say then, Alvaro, that there is an optimal emotional state then for brain neuroplasticity and building of cognitive reserve?
Yeah, my guess is that similar to plasticity, that one can conceive of an ideal emotional state that may be different for different cognitive functions, in fact, but importantly, that would be likely different for different individuals. It's not the same emotional state across the board for everybody. We need to personalize the optimal amount of plasticity in any one circuit, and by the same token, need to personalize the optimal emotional driver of that activation. But yes, one can probably make parallel arguments to the to the cortical plasticity on the level of the emotional driving of those connections.
Wonderful. Well, we have a few other questions, but Alvaro, we will send them to you directly.
Okay.
And then we can, and Stephanie, I assume you can copy out the questions for us?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, good. So there's just 2 or 3 that would be nice to share with the group, and we'll do that. Well, again, Alvaro, thank you so much. It's just such a privilege to hear your beautiful way of weaving together this very complex story around promoting brain health, plasticity, and cognitive reserve, and making our brains work well for as long as possible. So thank you so much. I'm sure everyone's inspired, and we'll be out walking and eating their salads later and connecting with others and talking about their higher purpose. So that's the recipe for today. Alvaro, did you want to leave us with a closing comment?
No, thank you very much. Obviously, there is a lot of questions and opportunities to clarify things further, but I hope to have given a little bit of an insight that what we start to learn from really basic mechanisms of brain function has direct translation and relevance to what we do in the day-to-day life, and what as coaches we want to promote in patients and how we want to guide them.
Thank you, Alvaro. I think we have a renewed purpose, knowing that we've got an important role to play in helping people prevent cognitive decline and decline in plasticity. So we appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again. Thank you all for listening, for your wonderful questions, and we look forward to seeing you. I don't know what our September webinar is, Stephanie, but we've got the conference coming up at the end of September. We hope very much that you'll join us. Thanks all. As I like to say, onward and upward. Bye, everyone.